Africa is a land with endless stories to tell. From epic battles, brilliant rulers, and the dramatic rise and fall of civilizations, join us on the History of Africa podcast to learn the oft-ignored stories of the African continent. From the sands of Cairo to the plains of Zimbabwe, and from the mountains of Ethiopia to the forests of the Congo, find the History of Africa podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
The year is 1370. In what we would call central Mexico today, a man by the name of Acampichtli is gathering support to make a significant political move. In 5 years, he will found the Aztec imperial dynasty and be the first Aztec ruler. In France, the 100 Years' War continues to rage on. The English will enjoy a series of victories under the brilliant commander Prince Edward, also called the Black Prince. But then the French will also inflict defeats upon the English. In 1370, they would defeat the English at the critical Battle of Pont-Valaine. This year saw the death of Pope Gregory XI and the succession of Pope Urban V as the 201st leader of the papacy. In the far reaches of Christendom, the Northern Crusades against the Baltic pagans was still warring on, and the year 1370 would see a force of Germanic Teutonic knights crush a small Lithuanian army at the Battle of Redau. Further to the east, a new power was rising. The Ottoman Empire, still in its fledgling state, was eager to expand. By 1370, the Ottomans had a firm foothold in both western Anatolia and parts of Eastern Europe, with their capital being moved to the city of Adrianople, which had recently been conquered from the Byzantines. In the Far East, Emperor Tran Ye Tong became the 8th emperor of the Tran dynasty in Vietnam in this same year. And in China, the young and powerful Ming dynasty had just recently pushed out the Mongol Yuan dynasty as masters of most of China. The last ruler of the Yuan dynasty, one of the 4 Mongol Khanates, was a man named Togon Temur, and he would perish in this same year of 1370. The 1300s have long been labeled the tumultuous century by historians. Countless wars, crusades, the Black Death, the collapse of the Mongol Khanates, several natural disasters, and political upheaval everywhere all fell upon the world in the 14th century. And in the year 1370, unknown to almost the entire world, a young man had just solidified his position among the tribes of Mawarnar. The reign of Timur had begun. At the age of 34 or 35, Timur had managed to defy the odds. He had arisen from the obscurity of the Barlas tribe to being a man whose name was recognized throughout all of Mawarnar. He had usurped his uncle Haji Beg as the leader of his tribe. He had proven his capable leadership throughout his time as a mercenary in the west and against multiple Mughal invasions. He had proven that his knowledge of the intricacies of steppe politics by masterfully forging and breaking alliances when the opportune moment was at hand. He had shown his men that he wasn't some high-born aristocrat raised with a silver spoon in his hand. No, this was a man who was born in the saddle, knew how to break a horse, who knew how to wield a saber, and how to guide his arrow to its mark. His shattered arm and leg were proof enough that he was no stranger to combat. By playing the politics, the marriages, and the invasions, Timur had secured himself as one of the most powerful men in Central Asia. And by destroying the city of Balkh and finishing off his brother-in-law Amir Hussein, Timur had nobody strong enough to stand in his way. In early April of 1370, all of Timur's experiences, all of his trials, all of his near-death adventures, it all led up to this. A Kurultai, or Mongol assembly, was held near the smoldering ruins of Balkh, and here the leaders of all of the powerful tribes knelt before Timur and pronounced him as Amir. The vote was unanimous. This was no longer Timur, the brave warrior from the Barlas tribe. This was Amir Timur, ruler of Mawarnar, the lion, the conqueror, and because of his recent marriage to the princess Sarai Khanum, this was Timur, son-in-law to Genghis Khan. And if you and I had been at this assembly, seeing the hordes of warriors pledging their swords to Timur, And knowing what we know about what Timur will become, it would be easy for us to mark this scene as the beginning of Timur's wars of expansion. But looks can be deceiving, and although this was no doubt the greatest victory Timur had yet earned, he stood on the edge of a thin, sharp knife. Historian Justin Morosi describes Timur's situation in 1370 with this. However great his ambition, however broad the stage on which he sought to make his mark, it is doubtful that the real Timur entertained such elevated comparisons in 1370. The titles he had gained, though magnificent, were deceptive. Master of a small swath of Central Asia, beset on all sides by hostile forces, Timur was neither emperor of the age nor conqueror of the world. And similarly, historian Beatrice Manns reminds us that in addition to the outside pressures, the greatest threat to Timur came from within. She writes this: "This was no end of Timur's labors. It was much easier to gain power over the Ulas Chagatai than to keep it." Both the Zafarnama and Timur's alleged autobiography go into significant detail listing all of the important leaders who were present at Timur's coronation. The names of the men aren't too important to us right now, but what is important to note is that leaders from every tribe of Transoxiana were here. The Suldus, the Kudalani, the Karaunas, the Apardi, the Jalayir, the Arlat, the Duklat, and of course representatives from Timur's own tribe, the Barlas. They're all here. Now, let's take a minute to put ourselves into the shoes of some of these tribal leaders. Let's say that you're the leader of the Kudalani tribe. You may speak of obedience to the lineage of the Khans, to the old Mongol Empire, to Amir Timur, but these are all formalities. They don't mean much more than that. Remember that there's no country or concept of country in play here. Thus, there's nothing like patriotism or nationalism that can ensure your loyalty to your neighbors. No, the only thing you are worried about is what's best for the Kudalani tribe, and more importantly, your position within that tribe. You want to ensure that your people have grazing lands, you want to be protected from your enemies, and you want allies whom you can go raiding with. But most critically, your position of leader of the Kudalani tribe is tenuous at best. This is no monarchy. It isn't God who put you on the throne or your father who handed the leadership down. Those may have played a part, but within these tribes on the steppe, leadership is earned mostly by merit. You lead the Kudalani people because they allow you to lead them. But as soon as you mess up, as soon as you jeopardize the safety and well-being of your tribe, you're gone. Because not only are there other powerful Kudalani families who would just love to take your position, but there are no doubt even some of your own family members who wouldn't mind replacing you. Remember that Timur defied his own uncle over leadership of the Barlas, and that's something that wasn't uncommon at all. Okay, so now that you know your position here, what on earth are you thinking while you're on your knees holding your scimitar before Timur, pronouncing him as Amir of Transoxiana? Well, your thoughts definitely depend on what tribe you're from, sure. If you're a leader in Timur's tribe, the Barlas tribe, then this Kurultai is fantastic. Your tribe has just gone from being a medium-sized band of people of mediocre importance to being the tribe of the Amir. That's great news, and sure enough, as we'll see, the Barlas tribe does very well under Timur. But as for the other tribes, as for you, the ruler of the Kudalani, this new political situation could be terrible news. If Timur is content with the title, content to retreat to the pasture lands of his people, then what does that mean for you? If you support Timur, your own adversaries could paint you as a weakling who has no problem bowing down and giving tribute to some unimportant, distant Amir. But if Timur does do this, and let's say you decide to defy him in order to keep your tribal autonomy and leadership, then your adversaries could jump on that as well. Look at how much Timur has helped our tribe. Don't you remember how he protected us from the Moguls and uprooted the corrupt Amir Hussein? How dare you defy him now? But you and I both know who Timur is. If he had chosen this path, to be content with his ceremonious title of Amir, content to graze his horses far away on his own land, this podcast would not exist. Timur would go down in history as little more than a footnote, the name of some unimportant tribal leader who never broke through the pages of time. And we've actually kind of seen this before. If you'll remember, before Timur's time, Amir Kazaghan, leader of the Kara-Unas tribe, and Amir of Transoxiana, he had ruled for a few years, went on a few raids, but never amounted to much more. And really, the only reason why Kazaghan is remembered at all is because he plays a small role in the early story of Timur. But speaking of Timur, we know that Timur is no Kazaghan. He is not content with what he has now. And the men and leaders at this Kurultai likely knew this as well. Timur was something else. He had refused to die time and time again. His defeats were always followed by a return and a refusal to give up. He had connections abroad because of his mercenary work. He had a band of loyal, battle-hardened warriors, and the surrounding world was an immense power vacuum. So again, as Timur commands you to stand up, to rise from your knees, as he praises you for your service in battle and rewards you with horses and jewels, what's going through your head? If Timur is truly the heir to Genghis Khan, what do you have to gain? Or, more ominously, what do you have to lose? Tribal autonomy was one of the most important values on the steppe. Submitting to an outside source meant you, as a human, as a warrior, as a man, were weaker. Maybe even inferior. And we've seen this dedication to tribal independence before. Amir Kazaghan, who we just mentioned, is generally remembered in the histories as a good leader, primarily because he didn't try to impose his will on the other tribes. He was content with holding the title of Amir and not pushing that to the extremes. But on the flip side, Amir Kazaghan's son, Amir Abdullah, if you'll remember, tried to do the opposite. He believed it was his right to rule the tribes in more than just name. And as we saw, the tribes reacted immediately to this. Abdullah was ran out, stripped of his power, and died in obscurity. Beatrice Manns summarizes this power dynamic beautifully with this. As long as the leadership of Transoxiana was contested, political initiative lay with the tribal aristocracy, but a strong central leader would inevitably try to limit the power of the tribes. So if you're the leader of the Kudalani, as you're remembering these events that occurred only 10 to 15 years ago, you have to decide what to do. If Timur attempts to consolidate his rule as the supreme ruler of Transoxiana and breaker of the tribes, your tribal autonomy will be shattered. Now, the implications of that are somewhat up to you. Should you bow to Timur and should you serve him well, then that could be quite good for your tribe. Of course, that's relying on the hope that Timur actually will be a successful ruler. Today, you and I know that he will be, but in 1370, outside of Balkh, these men had seen dozens of 34-year-old Timurs pledging that they would take the tribes to greatness. So do you risk it? Do you risk sticking to your allegiance to him? Or is this a step too far by this haughty Barlas man? Is he bluffing? Is he too full of himself? Surely some of the other tribes are worried about this new centralized authority too. If you were to defy Timur, maybe even defeat him, not only would you have an incredible claim to stay in control of your tribe, but your prestige would only become greater and the autonomy of your tribe would remain free. So what do you do? Now, that fun little exercise reminds us just how tenuous the positions of these tribal leaders were. The fear of their own family, the rival families, the wrath of their tribe, the fear of losing control of your own people, the fear of potential centralized prince demanding your submission, the fear of losing your own life in a multitude of ways, and the fear of the unknown future is this complicated and terrifying situation to say the least. So you can bet that this is what most of these leaders were thinking as they bent the knee. But now let's transition to Timur's mind. If the positions of the tribal leaders was complicated and dangerous, then Timur's situation was 1,000 more times complicated and dangerous. Because not only does he have to worry about his own family, his own tribe, and the rivals within, not only does he have to balance the leadership of his tribe with whatever the title of Amir brings, but now he has to balance the politics and the whims of every single tribe under his control. Timur stood on the edge of a thin, sharp knife. And the moment that he falters, the moment that he hesitates or shows the smallest ounce of weakness, the tribes will jump him. The vultures and the jackals are watching him tirelessly and from every angle, looking for any excuse to swoop in. Timur's position, his tribe, his family, his future, and his life are all hanging on the edge of destruction. So now, put yourself in Timur's position. You've just been made Amir Timur, son-in-law to Genghis Khan and ruler of Transoxiana. Now, what on earth do you do next? Now, thankfully for him, Timur had some things going for him at this point. Beatrice Manns breaks this down into 5 points. Number 1, first of all, Timur had complete control over the non-tribal soldiers. We haven't talked really at all about the soldiers and armies of Timur, or even of the Mongols, other than a few comments here and there. Now, don't worry, later on we will have probably several episodes where we solely focus on the soldiers who fought under his banner. We'll talk tactics, siege warfare, equipment, training, all that fun stuff at a later date. But for now, what we need to know is that Timur's army, especially here in 1370, can roughly be broken down into 2 groups. The greater and more powerful portion of his soldiers are the tribal warriors. These are the famed nomadic steppe warriors, skilled with bow, saber, and spear, men who have hunted and fought their entire life, men who live in the saddle, and men who are descendants of the Mongol warriors who struck fear into the entire world only a few decades ago. At this point in world history, you would be hard-pressed to find better, more capable soldiers than these, and especially in such great numbers. But, as we've been covering, the big problem with this is that they are tribal soldiers. Their allegiance isn't to Timur, not to the Timurid banner, it's to their tribe. The Arlat warriors fight for the Arlat, the Kara Unis soldiers fight for the Kara Unis. Now, if Timur can keep the loyalty of these tribes, then he's in business. But again, the loyalty of the tribes is, and likely always will be, highly questionable. But this brings us back to the second portion of soldiers that Timur is able to call upon, the non-tribal soldiers. Over the past decade or so, while Timur was serving as a mercenary in Persia, as he fought against the Mughals and on his other missions and adventures, he had attracted to himself a large body of men from all over Asia. There were Persians who had served with Timur among the ruins of the Ilkhanate. There were Badakhshanis and Afghan warriors, men who had grown up in the mountains and were renowned for their ferocity in combat. There may have even been other Mongol warriors from as far away as the Russian steppe or maybe even China who had come here seeking glory and wartime experience and now eagerly filed in behind Timur's banners. And while these men were certainly not as numerous as the tribal warriors, their greatest asset to Timur was that they were loyal to him. If they had a tribe, it was nowhere near here. They only had Timur, and they were ready to follow his every command. And in addition to this, going back to the tribal soldiers, there were certain tribes that Timur could count on more than others. More so than any other, of course, was the Barlas tribe, Timur's own people. The Barlas were quite eager to support Timur in everything he did, and they will remain one of his most important groups of supporters, really for the rest of his life. And further, there were a few other tribes that Timur felt more comfortable with. This leads us to the second thing going for Timur. Number 2. Amir Hussein, Timur's former friend, brother, and ally, had been a powerful regional figure. He was the leader of the Kara Unis tribe, which was one of the largest and most powerful tribes in Mawarnar. In fact, it was probably the largest tribe here at this time. And now that Hussein was dead, the leadership of the Kara Unis tribe was in question. Timur knew that if he let them choose their own leader, this person would likely become an adversary further on down the road, especially in light of what had just happened to Amir Hussein. So before this could happen, Timur appointed his friend Cheku Barlas as leader of the Kara Unis tribe. Cheku Barlas was Timur's closest friend, he was a member of Timur's tribe, and he was a competent leader in his own right. Now, of course, the Kara Unis were not too keen about being led by somebody who wasn't one of them, but what could they do? At this very moment, Timur and his entire entourage were having a Kurultai on the Kara Unis border. Any whisper of revolt, and Timur would no doubt come crashing into their heartland immediately. Further, Amir Hussein wasn't the most well-liked ruler even among his own people. And hey, you know what? Maybe Timur is actually the leader he claims to be. Maybe if we stick this out a little bit longer, we can see what happens and possibly ride the waves of fortune. So for now, the Kara-Unas were willing to submit to Timur, which meant that now he had better control over the most powerful tribe in Transoxiana, in addition to his own tribe and in addition to all his non-tribal soldiers. Number 3. The third thing that Mans lists is quite straightforward. Amir Hussein was dead. As we saw through the last few episodes, Hussein had been the most powerful and most influential person in Transoxiana. He by no means reigned supreme, but he was the biggest challenge Timur faced. And now that Hussein was gone, there was sort of a power vacuum that nobody could fill but Timur. Hussein had been the best last hope to defy Timur, whether the tribes knew it or not. And now that Hussein was gone, there weren't many notable candidates for Timur's adversaries to rally behind. The fourth thing that strengthened Timur's situation harkens back to the cultural makeup of Transoxiana. We've been mostly focused on the tribes, as they were no doubt the most powerful and influential people, but there was also a large settled population here too. For thousands of years, the Amu Darya and Sur Darya rivers have given life to agriculture, irrigation, and cities. And although these cities, such as Samarkand or Bukhara, had been recently wrecked by the Mongol and Mughal invasions and the Black Death, they were still of great importance. Not only were there settled men who could be conscripted here, but these cities were trade centers connected with the economic arteries of the Silk Road. Food, supplies, gold, trade, it all flowed through these cities. And if you're a merchant in one of these cities, the last thing you want is for all these neighboring nomadic tribes to be pillaging your farmlands, enslaving your children, and demanding crushing tribute. But that's how these cities have been living for over a century now. Sure, some tribes were kinder than others, but if there's one thing we learned, steppe politics are ever unpredictable, and trade needs predictability to thrive. So what does the settled population want? What do the farmers want? They want a strong, centralized leader who can keep the tribes under control, who can enforce legal codes, and who can keep the peace so trade can flourish. In other words, the settled population wants Timur. Fifth and finally, but perhaps most importantly, the greatest roadblock to Timur's power was also his greatest ally, and this is the politics of the tribes. Because going back to our little scenario earlier, if you're the leader of the Kudalani tribe, and let's say that you decide to defy Timur, to raise your armies against him in order to keep your independence, well, sure, that's a problem for Timur, but it seems you've forgotten about your cousin. Because your cousin wants your position, and you've heard that now your cousin is preaching about, no, submitting to Timur will further our glory. And now the tribe is divided. Your men are starting to leave you to join your cousin. There are calls for your cousin to replace you. Not a single battle has been fought, and you've already lost. Timur had to face the steppe politics, but nobody knew how this convoluted system worked better than he did. Timur was born into this web. He had risen through it. He had manipulated it to replace his uncle, to edge out his adversaries, and to become Amir. And if the leader of a tribe defied him, Timur knew that his new greatest ally was whoever was second in line to become leader of that tribe. So as confusing and tenuous as this ever-changing ocean of steppe politics could be, Timur knew that the tribes were not united. If a member of any of these tribes defied Timur, chances are that there was someone else in that same tribe who would be eager to help him. So in addition to those 5 things Timur had going for him, I want to add 2 other aspects that I came across. So number 6, if you will, is quite shorter but nevertheless important. Timur's name was known in Transoxiana. The tribal leaders, neighboring kingdoms, soldiers of all classes, merchants and farmers, they knew the name Timur. There was recognition and even admiration that came with it. Yazdi tells us that people started referring to Timur simply as the lion or the conqueror. Now, Timur was completely unknown to the vast majority of the world at this point. He has yet to break out onto that stage, but this was the beginning of the birth of the legend of Timur, and this will only increase as time goes on, of course. In fact, I have an entire book that's just a collection of various legends of Timur, which are stories that are completely fictitious, but nevertheless followed Timur throughout the ages. Finally, Timur had a seventh thing going for him, and that was this. The world was in ruins. Outside of Mawarnar, in all directions, empires were crumbling. The Black Death, as we talked about many episodes ago, was one of the biggest causes for this. And with the Black Death, huge famines struck all over the world as the workforce had been decimated. There were also plagues of locusts throughout northern Africa and the Middle East. There were earthquakes and storms, and all in all, the 1300s were a pretty terrible time to be alive. And with these disasters, it's no surprise that political structures were failing. Of the 4 Mongol Khanates, by 1370, 2 of them were gone. One was alive in name only, and the 4th was on its last legs, fighting for survival. The Il Khanate, the shortest lived of all the Khanates, had been gone for several decades now, and in its place arose a dozen or so smaller and weaker states that posed little to no threat to Timur. The second Khanate, the Yuan dynasty in China, had just 2 years prior, in 1368, been defeated and pushed back into Mongolia by the new Ming dynasty of China. China was back in the hands of the Chinese, and the Yuan dynasty, although surviving for a few years in Mongolia, would never again come close to its former glory. The Golden Horde on the steppes of Russia was the only Khanate that still existed, but civil wars, plagues, pressure from the Poles, Lithuanians, and Hungarians, and most of all, pressure from those pesky Russian princes who never stopped rebelling, this was all weakening the Horde tremendously. For the time being, Timur did not need to worry about the Golden Horde from the north. And finally, the Chagatai Khanate was now nothing but a formal memory. Timur had control of the western half, and the eastern half, Mogulistan, although a forever enemy of Timur, Mogulistan was experiencing a time of internal strife and was not concerned with its neighbors at the moment. Outside of the 4 Khanates, there were not too many factions nearby who could pose any threat to Timur at the moment. Persia was a mess of petty rival states. The Delhi Sultanate of India was also recovering from a period of internal strife, mixed with that ever-present struggle of a Muslim minority ruling over a Hindu majority. To the west, the Byzantine Empire was a mere shadow of what it had once been, barely hanging on for every year of its dwindling life. The Crusader states had been defeated, and there was no European foothold in the Middle East other than a few forts dotting the landscape. But other than in the Baltic or against the Turks, the age of crusading was nearing an end. Christian Europe was tired of campaigns that almost always ended in disaster. Speaking of the Turks, the Ottomans were a small but rising power in Anatolia. They had managed to forge for themselves small pieces of territory from the dying skeleton of the Byzantines, but they were nowhere near a threat to Timur at this time. And finally, far to the southwest, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was unconcerned with expansion at this point in time because the Black Death had wrought considerable destruction on Syria and Egypt, and this, coupled with internal political strife and ongoing wars with various European powers, meant Egypt was totally unable to make a move against Timur even if it had wanted to. All this to say, the world all around Timur was a political vacuum. If Timur could manage to keep control of the tribes, then he would be free to expand in whatever direction he chose. But the key, of course, was keeping control of the tribes. Now, one quick note here, while this is a brief description of the politics in 1370, Timur will by no means become the only wolf feasting on the ruins of empires. Several other factions and kingdoms will also emerge, seeking to expand their borders in the same place as Timur will. So don't think that Timur's reign is without adequate response by other world powers. He will have his moments and his battles where everything he holds is again in question. But at this moment, in 1370, he didn't really need to worry too much about outside forces. This brings us all the way back to Timur's Kurultai, which probably took place on April 9th, 1370. Timur has to act fast. He has to prove to everybody that he is completely competent. So that's what he does. As discussed last episode, Timur seized the wives and harem of the now deceased Amir Hussein and gave them out to various leaders who helped him on this campaign. Now, one horrific aspect to history at this point, and especially among the steppe, is that women were prized war spoils. Now, several women will play important roles in Timur's life, and interestingly enough, there are even a few sources that describe how there were women warriors who fought in Timur's ranks. But for the most part, and as we will continue to see unfortunately, women as spoils of war and as slaves played a key part in why soldiers went to war. And so this, as evil as it is, was a very effective way to gain loyalty with various tribal leaders quickly. And along with the women, the treasures, the horses, and weapons of Hussein and of the city of Balkh were all distributed to the various loyal tribes. Again, one of the best ways to ensure loyalty was to reward loyalty. And Timur will continue to be an expert at doing just that. But it takes more than the spoils of conquest to ensure his position. So immediately after the Kurultai, Timur appointed his friend Cheku Barlas as leader of the Kara-Unas tribe. He appointed a new governor of Balkh in order to rebuild the city and start getting trade rolling again, and then Timur headed north. He arrives at his home city of Kesh and stays here for about 2 months, continuing to feast his men, put the management of his city back in order, continuing to reward his followers, and solidifying his appearance as the figure of Amir. After this, he went to Samarkand and proclaimed that this city is the new capital of Transoxiana. Now, this was a risky move, as Amir Abdullah had done the same thing just a decade earlier, and this move of his had cost him everything. But Timur felt confident enough in his support that he was able to do this. And so with this proclamation, Samarkand began its journey of becoming one of the most glorious and important cities in the world. Yazdi says this: "He then departed for the city of Samarkand, which, for its charming situation, the freshness of its gardens, the strength and neatness of its buildings, and its delightful rivers, makes the finest cities in the world jealous of its beauty. This he made the seat of his empire and the place of his residence." Later, Yazdi foretells that because of Timur's governance of Samarkand, even Grand Cairo and Baghdad envied its prosperity and glory. And Yazdi is absolutely right. Samarkand will become one of the greatest cities of the era, and indeed of all time. Now, we will get more into the importance and life of the city in later episodes, but for now, here's what Timur did here. The walls of the city were repaired after decades of being neglected. Palaces and offices were built and filled with capable administrators. Public officers were appointed. Protection was given to religious rulers and buildings. Land grants were given. Legal systems are put into place, and eventually even an edict that no taxes would ever be levied from Samarkand or the nearby city of Bukhara. It was clear that Timur wanted to take this place to glory. So going back to some of those things that Timur had going for him, the settled population of Samarkand wanted Timur to do this. They wanted the safety, the security, and the prosperity that came from centralized leadership. But there was another important issue that needed to be taken care of here. As we discussed, Timur was not a descendant of Genghis Khan, and as such, he could never take the title of Khan, a title that had such immense weight and merit. So as we discussed the last episode, he did the next best thing, marry into the family of Genghis Khan, giving himself the title of son-in-law. And in addition to this, he followed the tradition of keeping an actual descendant of Genghis as a puppet Khan. This puppet Khan would continue to live a life of luxury and would show up for important ceremonies, but would have absolutely no political power. And although this may seem a bit pointless, it shows just how important the legacy of the Mongol Khans was. The people needed to know that their leader was supported by the royal family. Timur needed a Khan. Now, having puppet Khans had been a tradition for some time in the Chagatai Khanate. Amir Hussein had appointed a puppet Khan named Kabul Shah a few years prior. But with the struggle between Hussein and Timur, this Khan had, not surprisingly, thrown his support behind Hussein. And now that Hussein was gone, Timur was not about to let that stand. The puppet Khan, Kabul Shah, was seized and executed by Timur's soldiers. Whether or not Timur had a direct hand in this is up for debate. Our pro-Timur sources, of course, defend Timur with every breath, but I suspect that Timur had a hand in the assassination, especially since he wasted no time in replacing the puppet Khan with a new descendant of Genghis Khan. This new puppet Khan was named Soyur Gatmish, and would remain a loyal but powerless servant to Timur for about 18 years. Then, with his death, his son Mahmud Khan would serve as Timur's new puppet Khan, but both of these men were mere pawns of the greater political system. Timur only needed their name, their silent obedience, and nothing else. Historian René Grousset describes these puppet Khans with this: "No doubt they were mere shadow kings, entirely servant to Tamerlane and appointed at his pleasure. Poor, obscure men of straw, whom no one ever thought or cared about." And similarly, I know I've used this quote before, but I just love the imagery, so here it is again. Ahmad ibn Arab Shah describes these puppet Khans who were trapped just like a, quote, centipede in the mud. So Timur had made his intentions clear. He was a ruler who was not going to fade into history. He wanted his name to be known. And so, as can be expected, not everybody was happy with this. Amir Musa, a capable commander and tribal leader who had helped Timur and Hussein fight the Mughals on more than one occasion, who had been a friend to Timur, and who had been what Timur's autobiography calls the commander-in-chief to Hussein, Amir Musa was the first to make a move. During Timur and Hussein's final war, Amir Musa had at first fought bravely for Hussein before finally submitting to Timur. Timur received his old friend well, but Musa probably knew that his position, and maybe even his life, were in jeopardy. Thus, before Hussein was even killed, and before Timur's Kurultai, Musa fled. He gathered what allies and troops he could and went searching for new allies to help him in his inevitable war against Timur. There were several smaller tribal leaders who quickly rallied to Musa, but the most significant ally came with Zinda Hisham. We don't know too much about this man named Zinda Hisham, other than he was a prominent member of the Apardi tribe. He was not the supreme leader of the tribe, but he commanded a large enough amount of the support that he felt confident enough to ally with Musa in the rebellion. So when Timur called for his Kurultai, his assembly, in order to announce himself Amir, all the tribal leaders from throughout Transoxiana traveled to meet him. All, of course, except Amir Musa and Zinda Hisham, who were busy preparing for battle. And if their intentions were not clear enough, Musa and Hisham seized two other minor tribal leaders who were traveling to Timur to submit. One source says that Musa and Hisham offered wine to these men, waited for them to be drunk, and then slaughtered them. Whatever the method, our sources do agree that these two men were killed, and now Timur knew exactly where Musa and Hisham stood. But this again brings us back to the various strategies that Timur had going for him. If a member of a tribe rebels, simply seek out another member of the tribe to ally with. Zinda Hisham was a leader of the Apardi tribe, so Timur approached a different Apardi leader, a man named Uljetu, who was loyal to Timur, and then Timur asked him to deal with his fellow rebellious tribe member. But Uljetu politely refused Timur's request. And, what might seem as a surprise, Timur very graciously accepted Uljetu's excuse. And this shows us just how well Timur understood how tribal politics worked. Uljetu refused to attack Hisham probably because he was worried about his own position among the Apardi tribe. We're still at a time here where everybody is trying to figure Timur out, unsure of whether or not to submit to him, trying to gauge how strong he is. Timur knows this. So instead of punishing Uljetu and alienating a second leader of the Apardi, Timur brilliantly assures Uljetu that he completely understands the situation and don't feel any pressure. But what this means is that Timur has to deal with this himself. But he loses no time in gathering his forces and marching to the fortress where Musa and Zinda Hisham were fortifying themselves. And upon seeing the immense strength of Timur's forces and realizing that Timur is not going to stand for their games, Musa and Hisham immediately surrender and seek forgiveness from Timur. Yazdi describes Hisham's internal feelings with this: "The approach of Timur's army terrified him so much that he could find no other remedy than supplications and groans." I just love how Yazdi writes. Anyway, upon reaching Timur, the two men knelt before him, apologized, and asked for forgiveness. They also brought forth their swords and shawls to lay before Timur's feet. The display of sword and shawl before a ruler is a steppe tradition that signifies loyalty in battle, thus the sword, and loyalty to the death, thus the shawl. In response, Timur welcomed the men back as long-lost friends. He gave them gifts and held great feasts, signifying their return to the fold. Our pro-Timur sources assure us that this behavior came from the goodness of Timur's heart. But a closer look at this might be interpreted that Timur was just not in a position powerful enough to execute them, even if he had wanted to, and he knew this. Again, the other tribes are still looking for any red flags in Timur, and if he quickly executes adversaries without giving them second chances, showing that he, Timur, is not going to settle for anything short of total obedience, this might alienate some of the tribes. Thus, with Timur's early reign, we will see this often, forgiveness of men who rebelled against him. However, as time goes on, and as Timur's position becomes more and more supreme, his mercy towards his enemies will dwindle. For now, though, this was an excellent move on Timur's part. But showing mercy can bring with it some negative ramifications, and as might be expected, Zinda Hisham was not content to continue bending the knee to Timur. Yazdi explains this by saying, quote, Zinda was destined to a miserable end. But again, we have to remember that Zinda Hisham is primarily worried about his position in the Aparti tribe, and if he submits to Timur now, after so recently standing against him, his followers will likely view this as cowardice and weakness. So soon thereafter, Zinda Hisham abandons Timur in order to seek out new allies. Hisham finds aid from the governor of the city of Termid, which today is situated at the very southeastern corner of Uzbekistan. This governor, named Khanzada Abul Ma'ali, had recently had a dream in which God told him he would be the warrior and the leader of all of Islam, but thus needed to defy Timur. Whether this is true or not is certainly debatable, but Zinda Hisham had found his new ally, and the two men immediately set off to pillage the countryside around Balkh. But this rebellion goes about as well as you might expect at this point. Timur sent his friend and newly appointed leader of the Kara-Unas tribe, the man Cheku Barlas, to take care of this situation once and for all. Cheku Barlas led his forces in pursuit of the rebels and managed to ambush them as they were crossing a bridge of boats over the Amu Darya River. Caught between the raging waters and the arrows of Timur's men, Zinda Hisham's army fell to pieces, with many men thrown into the waves where they perished. Zinda Hisham managed to escape and remained on the run for some time, but eventually realized the desperate position he was in and surrendered. He was brought before Timur again sometime in late 1371 or early 1372. And so for the second time, Timur forgives Zinda Hisham and accepts his apology. But this time, Zinda Hisham is not allowed to leave the capital, being put under house arrest essentially, and certain responsibilities of his were given to more obedient men. We aren't quite done with Zinda Hisham though. He will make one more attempt to end Timur's rule, but that story will have to wait until next episode. These two revolts of Zinda Hisham's against Timur's reign, which came so soon after Timur's coronation, were insignificant in the long run. The histories only give the subject a few paragraphs at most, and Timur quickly crushed this opposition. Zinda Hisham's name is barely remembered, but the importance of Zinda Hisham's actions reveals something important to us, and more critically, they told Timur exactly what he had been fearing. For all his endeavors, for all of his soldiers and allies, for all of his treasures and titles, Timur's greatest enemy was time itself. Every minute that he stood idly by was another reason for the tribes to question their loyalty to him. It wasn't enough that Timur not make any mistakes. No. In addition to that, he has to act fast. He has to act immediately. The tribes are hungry, fiercely independent, and eager to rid themselves of Timur's yoke as soon as the opportunity presents itself. If Timur wants to be the man we remember him as today, if he wants to make any sizable mark on the pages of history, he has to act now. There is a quote attributed to Aristotle, and it's simply, "A common foe unites even the bitterest enemies." If Timur wanted to ensure the stability and loyalty of the tribes in his domain, then perhaps the solution to the internal chaos was to look externally. Attila the Hun managed to keep the countless Hunnic tribes of one mind and one goal by directing their eyes to the crumbling but rich lands of the Romans. Arminius managed to unite the Germanic tribes by illustrating to them that if they did not follow him, Rome would grind them beneath her heel. And Genghis Khan, the great Khan of Khans, united the Tatars, the Merkits and the Nayman, and the Karaites, and countless other hostile warring tribes by promising them the world. The tribes underneath Timur would eat him alive if their wrath and warlike tendencies were not satisfied. If he wanted to survive, Timur needed to look beyond his borders. This has been the Timur Podcast. If you want to reach out to me for any reason, or if you want to follow the show for updates and future episodes, email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com or check out the show's website, timurpodcast.com. If you want to follow the show on social media, all of the handles have been changed to be the same, finally, after more than a year. So things are a lot less confusing. I don't know why I chose different show identities for every different social media site, but now simply search for Timur Podcast on Twitter, Reddit, or Facebook, and you'll find me. Before we finish this off, I wanted to say again thank you, because 2020 has been such an interesting year, and because of some personal issues I needed to work on, the show had to be put on pause for a few months, and you have been so encouraging and patient and understanding through it all. It really blew me away. So to everybody who reached out to me with words of encouragement and advice, seriously, thank you. I can't tell you how much it meant just getting so much love and encouragement. Your support does keep this show going. And speaking of, today's episode kicks off Season 2 of the Timur Podcast. I decided that since it's been such a long time since our last episode, and since Timur's coronation marks a huge new chapter in his story, why not break it down into seasons? This is purely for organizational purposes, nothing more than that, but this is the beginning of Season 2. Anyway, next episode, the conquests of Timur begin. Join me next time right here on the Timur Podcast.